From 1618 to 1648, Germany was ravaged by the 30 Years' War. This war was, by all standards, a terrible catastrophe for the European continent and especially the Holy Roman Empire. Vast parts of the German countryside resembled an apocalyptic landscape, with some areas experiencing a population loss of up to 50%, with an average of 20% for the empire. Gone were the days of the prosperous German cities. Not without reason, Schiller used the following words to describe this period of German history. A whole generation perished. Towns and villages vanished from the map. The peasantry was exterminated or reduced to beggary and slavery. Civilization receded. But how did the people of that time experience this period? How did they cope with the constant fear of plague, starvation and ravaging armies? It is for this reason that in this video we are going to find out how the people survived the 30 Years' War. Everything began in 1618 when furious residents of Prague stormed the town hall. A year earlier they had elected the Habsburg Prince Ferdinand II as King of Bohemia. Ferdinand was a zealous Catholic but had agreed on respecting the religious freedom of his predominantly Protestant subjects. This promise, however, did not last very long, and soon he began to restrict their influence within his realm. For this reason, in May 1618, the people of Prague stormed the town hall and threw his representatives out of the window. Right then, they probably did not know that they had just kick-started one of the most gruesome wars in German history. It took not long for Ferdinand to react, and in 1620 he crushed the Protestant uprising in the Battle of the White Mountain, one of the most decisive engagements of the whole conflict. He could have learned from this, but instead he decided on doubling down on his efforts against the Protestant Church. It took not long for Protestant powers to intervene, like Denmark and later, more importantly, Sweden. Even Catholic France intervened on the side of the Protestants. For 30 years no one was able to win the war through military means. No battle was decisive enough, and therefore the conflict escalated to a brutal tug of war. For 30 years, which can be a whole lifetime, the people of Germany knew nothing but war, and this is how they survived. As you can probably guess, these soldiers were the most important actors of the conflict. Back in these days, you did not have professional standing armies, though the Austrians operated some along the frontier to the Ottoman Empire, but for logical reasons, this one could not move. Most of the soldiers were mercenaries who were hired in case of war and then later dismissed as soon as the war was over. However, due to the military situation of the 30 Years' War, no side had the luxury to disband its forces. Therefore, during the 30 Years' War, armies became a community of their own. For example, the soldiers were also accompanied by their families. One of the most important sources for this is Peter Hagendorf. Hagendorf joined the army as a mercenary in 1625 and kept on fighting till the very end. And to our luck, he kept a diary that tells us a lot about the average life of a soldier. One important task was to garrison cities, so that gains from a campaign could be maintained for the next season. These garrisons were often unwanted, as the city had to provide for the man, even if the soldiers and the city were on the same side. Looting was another important task. In accounts from the conflict, armies are often compared to swarms of locusts. There was never enough food to feed all the soldiers and their families. If the local population refused to give up their provisions, soldiers were forced to take them by force. In desperate times, armies took everything from the peasantry: food, animals, valuables, furniture, and even their homes. Though for some it served the purpose of personal enrichment, many just did it to survive. Hagendorf, for example, sold a looted horse to pay for the medicine of his ill wife. The most important duty of a soldier, of course, was to fight. Armies of the 30 Years' War consisted of infantry, cavalry, and artillery. Both infantry and cavalry made heavy use of firearms. The cavalry, for instance, carried 2 pistols that they fired at close range. Cannons caused devastating casualties, as they were fired at angles that made cannonballs bounce along the ground, tearing through formations and killing multiple men with a single shot. At the end of the day, however, battles were still decided by close combat, by cavalry or infantry charges that forced the enemy to flee. Battles were bloody affairs, as shown by a body found at the site of the Battle of Wittstock in 1636. Individual 71 was a young man from Scotland who fought in the Swedish army. This was not unusual, as many Scotsmen served as mercenaries during the war. The 22-year-old was first struck by a bullet in the shoulder, which prevented him from fending off a halberd strike aimed at his head. A stab to the throat ended his life. Young and far from his home, he was one of 125 men buried in a mass grave near the battlefield, which was ultimately won by Sweden. The body of the young Scotsman tells us much about the lives of soldiers during the 30 Years' War. He suffered from a chronic infection, tooth decay, malnourishment and bone attrition caused by the enormous distances he marched. He must have been in great pain and lived a miserable life. He was no exception. The excavation showed that only a quarter of the 125 men died during the battle. The others succumbed to disease and infection. Death was a constant companion for the man who fought in the 30 Years' War. The mercenary Peter Hagendorf had to bury 6 children and his wife during the conflict. Most of them did not reach the first birthday. For the civilians, the war was just as bad. Especially terrible were the conditions in the countryside, where the peasants had no hope of escaping marauding armies. Their only prayer was that no army at all would march through their land. If an army was approaching, they could attempt to hide the animals, food, and little money they had. But this often made things even worse. Hungry soldiers became even more dangerous, resorting to torture to discover hidden supplies. The Swedish forces, for instance, sometimes forced peasants to drink sewage water, a form of torture known as the Schwedentrunk. Women and girls were also frequent victims of sexual violence. Contemporary sources describe countless barbaric acts against unarmed villagers. The mercenary Peter Hagendorf, in his diary, reports several cases of looting, cattle theft, and rape, without showing any sign of remorse. Such behavior seems to have been considered normal among soldiers of that time. Many peasants fled whenever rumors spread that an army was approaching. They sought refuge in the nearby towns or monasteries, which were usually protected by walls. As a result, many towns quickly became overcrowded with refugees, leading to starvation and disease. The townsfolk fared somewhat better, as their walls offered protection from roving soldiers. For them, it was crucial to remain neutral in the conflict. Taking sides could mean becoming a target for the enemy or being forced to host and supply a friendly garrison. Cities were often required to pay contribution money, a kind of protection tax meant to prevent looting of the town and surrounding countryside. Sometimes, the payment took the form of food or supplies for the army. Over time, many cities could no longer afford these contributions, and when that happened, siege was inevitable. While most cities had defensive walls, few were modern enough to withstand prolonged cannon bombardments. Many were still built in the medieval style. For example, Minden had a modern fortification and was looted only once after a long Swedish siege, whereas Lübbecke suffered repeated attacks and was forced to pay large sums of money several times. When a city fell, citizens had 2 grim choices: pay an even higher ransom, known as Brandschatzungsgeld, or face plunder and destruction. The most infamous case was the siege of Magdeburg in 1631. After 2 months of resistance, Swedish troops stormed the city on May 20. In the following massacre, about 20,000 inhabitants were killed within 4 days. This atrocity entered German history as the Magdeburg Wedding or Blood Wedding. Bluthochzeit. The constant movement of soldiers and refugees led to a rapid spread of disease throughout the Holy Roman Empire. Malnutrition weakened the population, making people more vulnerable to plague, typhus and syphilis, which had already plagued Europe for over a century. Towns tried to contain outbreaks by imposing strict quarantine measures, but these were not always effective. In 1634, for example, Munich was struck by a plague epidemic brought by Spanish soldiers. About 1/3 of the city's population perished. For 30 years, the people could only choose between joining the war, hoping that it would pass them, or losing everything they had. But now, in 1648, the war was finally over. And it was not ended on the battlefield, but at the negotiation table. In the Westphalian cities of Münster and Osnabrück, thousands of envoys debated for years how to achieve a lasting peace. In 1648, the Peace of Westphalia was finally ratified. Life slowly began to improve. Due to the massive loss of life, labor became more valuable, and much land lay vacant, allowing former soldiers to reintegrate into society. For a long time, the fate of Peter Hagendorf remained unknown. Recently discovered documents revealed that he returned to Brandenburg, his birthplace. Here he lived with his wife and his only surviving child, and became a mayor. He would die in 1678. During the war, he had marched more than 22,000 kilometers. I really hope you liked this video. If you want to see more, subscribe and give it a like. Bye.